I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of like dating, right?
Dating?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you could, meet your high school sweetheart and spend the rest of your life with that person, and you might have got lucky, or maybe at some point you got lazy. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Or you might date a few persons before you find your right match. And I think working is kind of the same, especially in the creative field. I feel like where it really varies depending on the firm you're in. So yes, I think it's a great idea to move around.
When you first graduated from your school, did you know that you were going to move between offices every so often? Did you have that as a plan in your mind?
No, I mean, I didn't even know where I wanted to work. So, like think about moving offices, like what? And, I feel like also when I was in school, I knew that offices were doing different types of projects and work, right? I don't think it was necessarily something I really deeply thought about, that depending what firm I would be working in, that would be the only type of project I potentially would be working on.
Huh. Yeah.
Because why would I be thinking about that?
Right.
There's like so many other like big things I have to think about. Like graduating, I had no idea if I wanted to like design hospitals or, private homes or public libraries and museums. Like, I don't think I had an answer to that. Even if maybe I was more interested in one or the other, like I don't think I would have maybe picked a place based on that.
Well,
which I know some people do, right? I graduated out of school, and to me it's amazing that you already know that.
Did you design a bunch of different types of projects in school? No, you didn't design presumably just houses in school. You probably designed...
No, so I think it was a lot of housing, single family and multifamily housing.
In school?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And a lot of it had to do on like how it integrates with the urban fabric. And I think we had maybe a couple of projects. One was a public library on the outskirts of Paris.
Yep.
And another one was some sort of like center,
community center type of thing.
Not even. It was like about the landscape of the region.
Okay.
Kind of like looking at the environment, like a building that just kind of like looked at the environment that was around, something kind of abstract like that.
Yeah.
And then my year abroad, we did like a few things that were a bit more of the, again, kind of like abstract, atypical type of program.
Like what?
One project we did was as a group project, was kind of like a visitor center.
Okay. Another center.
Another center, yeah. But it wasn't like, oh, okay, you have to fit like 5 rooms, a mechanical room, and kind of like the boring program stuff you have to fit. We kind of came up with our own program and our own approach to what the center should be, not like a standard building.
Just so for listeners, what was it? A center for what though? For art? For farming?
For visitors. It was for a site that was basically sand dunes along the beach.
Okay.
And so it was a place where a lot of people would come and hike and spend the day. And the idea was that the center could offer people to be able to spend the night, kind of like camp.
Okay.
Or visit the day and observe the dunes and the landscape around it by being in that building.
Gotcha. A dune center.
Dune center, yeah. Nothing related to the movie Dune. Okay, just standard dunes. That was kind of it. I don't think I've ever done a museum or a hospital or an hotel or an art installation. I don't think that ever was in the project. Yeah.
So how many...
Actually, my thesis project was more of like a complex, again, center with multiple activities, large scale.
What was the topic of the center, though?
I think it was something along the lines like reconnecting with the city or something like that, by like interacting with the building. It was like, I don't know, a little confusing.
Okay. Interacting. Okay. So... That's interesting. So how many projects in school did you do that were multifamily or housing of any type, you think? Like
most of them.
Most of them?
Most of them.
Really?
Yeah.
Like apartment?
Yeah, I mean, because I think I don't know why. I don't know if it's because the school was in Paris and housing in dense, in quote, because there's denser city than Paris, is always kind of like a question. Or, if it's a way for the school to make students sensitive to the topic of providing housing to people who cannot necessarily just afford hiring an architect to design their homes, right? So maybe they were trying to create a balance between, working on custom single family and like more like multifamily type of thing. Yeah.
So I know the purpose of this topic is to talk about working in different places, but the multifamily housing structures designed in school, was it always an infill project where the site is stuck between two buildings and it's basically a facade, a front facade, back facade architecture?
That is a good question.
Were you interrogating the interiors?
One of them was an infill. It was a corner site. It was kind of like in a weird location. It was very much an infill. It was kind of like how to recreate the corner of the street by adding that building. Another one,
that's a good project.
It was very difficult. Another one was a vacant lot, a really big vacant lot near the Eiffel Tower. I mean, not like right across from it, but like very close to it.
Yeah.
And so the idea was to kind of like transform the site, So it was a large scale urban infill, I would say, project. With like, I don't know, it was like 3 or 4 buildings on that site probably.
I think that's interesting because in school, it sounds like the projects I did and my classmates did were much more varied than you.
Yeah, probably.
So I'm trying to recall if I did any multifamily housing in school. I don't think I did. I mean, I did on the scale of like a tower, a conceptual tower, but not probably at the scale that you're talking about of a 4-story structure where the focus is doing a quote real building. But yeah, I mean, it was a mixture of everything. There was art installations for sure. There were a lot of museums, libraries, stadiums, centers, like you said. There's always a center or community program that's vague and has some specific angle. Like I don't think this was my class; it was another person's class, but or a memorial that's in the center of a public space, like a 9/11 memorial. I think the diversity of the projects seemed to be greater. The school that I went to.
Well, I think
one was like the center for the manufacturing of a humanoid robot, like this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think at that time French schools were probably trying to be more practical as to how to train their students to actually work on potential real projects. So, stadiums, it's like how many stadiums are getting built in France? Not that many. So, same with museums. Like there is a few, but it's, it was the big firms and therefore just a handful of people ever get to work on them.
So did you know when you were in school that you preferred certain types of projects or you remained just open to?
I think I was just curious about the field in general and not that, specific about project types.
So let's see. You worked for a bunch of different offices. Upon looking back, is there a general amount of time per office you recommend, staying at a minimum or a maximum? Or how would I know if I just graduated? How would I know how long I should stay at my first office or my second or third office or whatever it is?
It's tricky because I feel like you could, in order to really judge and learn enough from a place, you probably need to be there at least a year. Right. And by year 2, you are getting, more in the groove of things. Maybe you have more responsibility and get to kind of like evolve a little bit in the firm. In the same time, I think over 2 years, you're probably not going to move anymore because it's just like projects take so long that you're going to be like deeper into projects by that time. So, and if you stay less than a year, I think it might be good if like you just kind of like want to scope out a few places, but I don't think you can really learn much in a few months, to be honest.
No.
Because it takes, especially, our experience was in New York City, so it was a really busy place, fast. So actually maybe the timeline I'm mentioning is more applicable to places like this. If you work in a place that's much slower, then maybe just a few months is enough to kind of like get an idea of the land before you move on to the next one.
Oh, I was thinking the opposite. Less time in calendar months is worth more in a place like New York City because the work happens faster.
Or that.
Like I had for myself, but also some colleagues and friends, they would be at an office for let's say a year, which again, to your point, is not a long time, but they worked probably like 3 years worth of time.
Yeah.
And the design and documentation phases when they were at those offices was so condensed that they learned a lot. Now, there is the fact that when it comes to construction, yes, certain projects are expedited and you have crews working, double shifts, or rather you have different crews working around the clock, and construction happens faster. But for the most part, construction is going to go at its own pace. And that's probably the phase of the work of a building where, relative to working in an architecture office, there's not much an architecture office can do to control the speed of construction. So, on the subject of getting experience at an office, there's the architecture experience, and then there's the architecture meaning design and documentation, and then there's the experience of doing CA and being part of the construction effort and witnessing that and doing CA. And that's the part that's the experience that's harder to get, because the percentage of projects that are in an office but don't get built is quite high. Actually, people might be surprised. It's quite high. So from an employee's perspective, from a young architect's perspective, it's difficult to get on a project where it's seen through, because the fall off rate is whatever it is. And then also that takes time. So like you can't be in an office for just a year and expect to experience a project. Well, I guess it depends on the scale of the project, but generally speaking, you can't expect to be in an office for a year and also go from the very beginning of concept design all the way through documentation and then finish construction in a year. It's just not going to happen unless we're talking about really small, like art gallery remodel kind of things.
Yeah.
Common in New York, also art gallery remodels.
I mean, into projects in a few months, you can see them done. But if you're doing like ground up construction or extensive remodel, it would take a while.
Years.
And if the project doesn't get put on hold too for 2, 3, 5 years.
Yeah.
Which happens often too.
Yeah, I was speaking with an architect who's the head person at this major office in California, and there are maybe 60 people or so, do great work, big projects, small projects, good, well-rounded office. And he's like, we have some staff, and for the last 8 years, they've never had any of their projects built. And it's not because they intentionally put them on projects that are not going to get built or that they're doing something wrong. It's just the universe has fallen that way where it happens to be that those projects never got constructed. And so anyway, so your turn to talk. I've used up my 5% of my 10%. So.
What was your question again?
I don't have any questions.
I think it was great to work at different offices. In terms of scale, I worked at offices that were like 3 people, including myself, 12, 40, and 90. So, and 500.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting to experience offices at each of these scales. Mm-hmm. First of all, because you see how a business is run at those different scales, the types of project that comes in, how you fit within those places. Some people feel very comfortable in like a really small team. Mm-hmm. Some absolutely don't. So I think it's a good exercise for yourself to kind of understand like who you are as a human body, mm-hmm. and what is your ideal environment. What is your happiest place to be in.
And your point is you can't really know that.
You can't really know that by thinking what you might be liking best, mm-hmm. without actually experiencing it. So I think it's a good idea. And sometimes right away things are not the right fit, and therefore there's no need to stay there any longer than the few days that you need to be there for.
Yeah, and the subject of how would I know when I should leave an office? There are general rules of timelines, like you said, the 1 year, 2 year mark, and it does take about 2 years before you feel settled in. Mm-hmm. But there's also just the more subjective first-person experience of being in that office. If you show up and you're miserable every day, nothing else that we're saying in this recording matters, and you should just leave. And I think that knowing when to trust your gut, I think more people should trust their gut in general, but I think that's hard to do when you're young, right? So let's imagine we're talking about someone who's working currently at their very first office. When you're working at your first office, you probably have a lot of feelings and thoughts as to what is good what is right and wrong about the office
Right.
in all the ways. Pay, organization, design quality, design studio culture, everything, right? But do you trust yourself and your opinions when it's your first job? Not as much as if you were an experienced person. But my philosophy has always been, through my experience, is that people who go through architecture school and they graduate, assuming they went to a good architecture school, you're smart. You're like a smart person. And your gut is probably pretty dead on.
Yeah.
So the mistake that I see that young aspiring architects make is that they don't trust themselves when they have rendered an opinion about an office, especially when they feel like this office is not doing something right. Because again, they don't trust, they don't believe. What do I know, right? Maybe all offices function this way. Maybe this is normal. Maybe it's okay that we're working really late hours all the time. Maybe it's standard that the design quality is not there. Maybe it's standard that we don't talk about concepts ever. Maybe. But does it feel right? No, it doesn't feel right. Like, why aren't we talking about concepts in the office or whatever it might be? And anyway, so those people are smart, and I think they should trust themselves more often because they are right. Right? If you feel like something's being mismanaged and the faculty is being mismanaged, or you have a project manager and you feel like they're not very nice to me and they're not very organized, there's 100% chance that you're right. And I think when you're that young, though, the difficulty is knowing at what point is it enough wrongness to leave an office.
Well, I think if when you talk to your coworkers, if there is mutual feelings that are being shared, and opinions that align, it probably tells you you're not the only person thinking that, and you're not the only person thinking it's not right. So therefore, hello,
Yeah. I think that's also where having a network, building a community, having friends who are in the same profession, talking to others who work in other offices to see what it is like. Look, no office is perfect, right? So if you come to any office, especially a first one, expecting it to be perfect, and you decide, I'm going to leave if it doesn't meet all of my criteria perfectly, then you're forever going to be in the zone of bouncing around from office to office like every 2 months, which is, of course, not what you want. So there is also the reality of you have to accept that any office you're in will have some shortcomings.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. And, it's funny because when you're young, I think you're scared of switching office because you have to build that resume, right? You're thinking like, well, I'm not going to get another job because I'm not that experienced and it's going to be tough for me to find a spot. The thing is, when you're the youngest, you're the most nimble, right? Like you can bounce back, you can leave cheaply, you can kind of like make things work for a while, like you can take on a job for a little bit while you're looking for another one in the meantime. Like you have more option than when you are less young. And because you're still basically an architect under development, right? I feel like once you are too developed, it might be harder for you to like switch because then you fit in one box or another a bit more. So people only see you maybe one way or the other, right? When you're younger, I think you have more opportunity. But so I think when to switch office if something feels wrong or it's not suiting you or it just doesn't align with who you are and what you're looking for. I think, and that happened for me a couple of times. But I think another thing is that could be making you switch office is if you feel like you're not getting anything anymore from that place, or if you feel like you need to learn other things, and that office maybe might not be offering you that.
Yeah.
And that happened for me several times. Like. One thing I always wanted to do as far as my experience was construction administration, right? And you're young, if you happen to be a female, sometimes they just put you on interior design stuff rather than like on construction sites. So that's something I knew I wanted to be learning, and I kind of had to move around and keep asking for it before I got to do that, right? So I think if there's things you want to learn, and I was in an amazing office with great people, but the design wasn't enough part of my everyday and what I was working on, that I felt like that's a skill I needed to develop, right? So went to an office that was doing a lot more design, maybe too much design, and a place actually wasn't treating people right.
Oh, what do you mean by too much design?
Well, it's interesting. I think there is offices that are very much about the value that they bring and how they problem solve and how they handle clients and the type of project they work in, and kind of like a bit more subdued. in terms of design, you
Okay.
know, but it's still very good.
Yeah.
And then there is sometimes offices who are like too much about how things look and the design, and they don't care about the people, they don't care about the clients, they don't care about, you know, running the best office. They only care about how the final products look like and the thing in the portfolio.
Gotcha.
You know, so, you know, but you learn those things as you go and work in the different places, right? Like you don't just like hear about it, you have to kind of witness it in some ways. So I think if you are interested in learning or owning some of your skills, you might have to be moving offices to get to be doing that. Because unless you're very lucky and you find the perfect fit, the perfect office, great people, and all the things you want to learn there, I think you're going to have to move around to do that.
Well, so there's the fit through the lens of whether or not you vibe with the office, just maybe
Office culture, the
office
people,
culture,
yeah.
and there's also whether or not the office is allowing you to fulfill your immediate, not even career goals, but experience goals and learning objectives, right? And so anyone who's trying to become a licensed architect, you have to go through I think it's now called the AXP. You have to gain a certain amount of experience in different aspects of architecture to then get your license. That's the way it works in the United States, roughly speaking. And so there is an aspect of like everyone, even if you've just graduated or you're still in school, you need to think about what are your larger career goals. I'm not saying you have to have those goals written in stone and you have to know them for sure and they're never going to change at the age of 23 or whatever it is. But I think having those in the back of your mind and always thinking about them and tinkering on them as you move forward is important. Because I think it's also very easy to let, you know, time go by, years go by, and you realize I've never actually done the thing that I was first interested in, or I've never completed this learning objective I had, whether it come from the AXP, that program, or yourself of doing CA or design or interiors or facades or whatever it is. And I think always having that in the back of your mind is important. I also think that one of the differences between practicing as a young professional and being in school is that in school, the curriculum is outlined for you, right? And you just kind of have to go through the steps. Now, if you're at a big school, where your year is a couple hundred students, that's a big architecture school. There's more ability for you to carve out your own path, and therefore more the ability for you to claim your own responsibility to do your own thing and think about your career and your learning objectives, because you have so many people to move between different teachers. But generally speaking, in school, things are better outlined for you, right? You go through the 3 quarters or 2 semesters or whatever it is. It's structured. The teacher gives you assignments and you go through step. When you get into your career and you're practicing, it's different. Now you're on your own, and you have the responsibility to, on your own, decide what it is you're trying to achieve and learn, and no one's there to really guide or tell you. And I think that's maybe the part of it where people fall off to the wayside, or again, years go by and they realize I've not actually done anything that I wanted to do the last 8 years, because maybe they didn't think about the fact that they're in the ocean. No one's going to guide you. No one's going to tell you, you should be doing this now, you should be doing that now, you know, in the broad career lens perspective. I do think a good office will have people, leadership in the office, who will ask you these questions and say, what are you trying to achieve? Let's help you get there. But
those are rare.
Those are rarer than we would like, and for the most part, offices are concerned with, we have a deadline Friday. Let's work to get that deadline done, and then Friday's completed. Yay! Oh, great! We have another deadline next Friday, and again, time goes by. So it's really important, I think, for younger professionals in particular to think about that.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Like, I don't think I ever imagined myself, I was going to say, aging in an office, but I kind of
like withering away at your desk.
No, but if you think about it, like, you're in your 20s, you're in New York City, like, you're bouncing around offices, you're trying to find like the right place for you and like the type of project, and like keep yourself happy and excited about going to work every day, right? And then you do find an office that's great. It's a good fit. You're there maybe like 5 years, 6 years, 7, right? And then it comes 7 year and you're like, okay, I'm in my like mid-late 30s now. Like, what do? Do I stay in that same office for the next 15 years? Do I bounce and switch up to another place, and I kind of have to like restart from zero, because every time you start in a new office, in some ways you're starting a new relationship again.
Yeah,
right.
it's a
So
lot.
you know, you have to like meet everyone, show who you are, learn everybody's name, understand how the office works.
Where's the printer?
Like,
How do I log in?
You
Like all
know,
that stuff.
like, you know, just kind of like the routine, right? To get into the groove of things, and depending on the office, it could take more or less time. But every time you have to kind of
It's a lot.
like relearn that.
It's a lot.
And you know, maybe they use the software differently, like this and that. They have different standards, and why not? So it's it's kind of like when you stay in an office and you have done that, you invested into that place, right? You invested some of your time and mental space into that place. So every time you switch, you have to redo that. But yeah, what do you do when you've been in the same office for like 8 years? You're at, I don't know, or even in your 40s. Are you gonna? It's either, I feel like there's two paths. Either you stick around for another like 15, 20 plus years, and eventually someone dies and you become a partner, right?
Yeah.
I mean, to be real. Or you decide to switch up into another office, and maybe you do that like 2 or 3 more times before you retire, right? So,
but I think also you're outlining.
or you start your own, or you're like, you know what? I think I've learned enough. Like this is, I think I'm good to fly on my own now.
Yeah. I think you're talking about maybe the 8 years into a career. At that point, what do you do? Do you choose an office and stay with it? Do you stay at that office longer, or do you do your own thing? And that's a different set of questions. And I really think at that.
And I think that's a harder question than like, I'm out of school and how long do I stay and what do I do? Because you're gonna bounce around and it's totally fine, and you should, right?
Sure.
But after a certain point, you kind of have to decide what you're gonna be doing.
You do. So that's where also I think that even this is not for everybody, but I think for myself at least, right? I probably always knew I was going to have my own practice at some point, because I'm just that kind of individual. I don't staying in an office a long term, not really. I think, of course, I was always thinking to myself, well, if I find an office that just feels right, and at some point after you've worked at a few places, you kind of, again, you trust your feelings, you trust your instincts. You can just feel like this is a good fit. The design is good. Everything's like on where I want it to be in terms of my goals. And I'll stay here long term. And I always felt like, I'm totally open to that, because why go through the headache of having your own practice if you can get the same rewards and produce good work under the banner of a different office? Like, who cares? That never quite happened for me. So there, now we have our own practice. But I do think for some people, I know from a pretty young age that they're likely to have their own practice. And I think that's still something to keep in mind. I've also come to learn and appreciate that not everybody wants to have their own practice. Like, I've always felt it was crazy to me just to work in an office for decades. But when I think about it,
Now that you have your own office.
well, statistically speaking, most people will do that, right?
Yeah.
It's not like most people have their own practice. Of course not. If the average office is, I don't know, 20 people large, I just made up a number. That means, I don't know, only 5% of people are firm owners, and the rest work at practices for the long term. And I've come to kind of, I don't know, just acknowledge and appreciate that out of necessity as well, since now we own an office.
I think the idea of having a boss never appealed to me.
That's what I'm saying.
But
it's a personality.
But now that we have an office, I'm like, yeah, you know what? I totally get that you would not want to be the one responsible for everything. Like, there is kind of like a peace of mind at the end of the day that you don't have to worry about, but just, clocking in, clocking out, thinking about work when it's time to think about work, and then have your weekends and your free time not to have to worry about it. So yeah, it's becoming more and more appealing actually to work for someone else.
What else though about working at different types of offices? We talked about timeline. You said a year is just enough time to sort of get to know somebody. 2 years is when you start to really feel like you're in sync with the office. You talked about working at offices of different sizes and understanding what it's like to be an office of different sizes. What about different project types?
I mean, project types are also a great way to kind of see like how things work, right? Because you work on, I don't know, let's say interior commercial spaces in a city, It's very different than if you work on a project overseas. It's very different than when you work on a custom home that's, going to be like millions of dollars to build. It's different than when you work in like neighborhoods that are disprivileged and there is no budget and they need that building and that project to help and heal the community. So I think kind of like seeing all of the different colors of projects and types is super helpful. Also for your own creative skills to be able to kind of like problem solve and create, right? I think it stimulates things a little bit more than if you're always playing the same field with the same tools, doing the same stuff, because that's when repetition happens to me. So I think just getting curveballs thrown at you all the time just makes you like, in some ways, more resilient, potentially more desirable for clients and offices, because you have a broader, understanding and approach to things.
So the counter argument to that, which is very common, is that if I'm a client or maybe also an architecture office, I would rather hire the expert who has extensive knowledge about one building type, for example.
Yeah, that's true. And, to each their own, right? Like if that's what you're looking for, then there is lots of people who can provide that. But I do believe in the value of not going that route. And it doesn't mean that you can't be an expert at things if you know multiple of them, And to me, I feel like there is more creation to someone who has more diverse experience than someone who doesn't. And it may be even innovation, because then things start to, cross-pollinate between, hospitality, residential. Now you start thinking about a multifamily building in a way that's completely different than all of those other firms that have only been doing multifamily, right? It's like, offices who have, someone from a different field that joined their team. Like, you have a landscape architect in an architecture office. Well, you're going to look at projects and building in a very different way than an office that doesn't do that. So, and it's, I think that it's like what makes you unique, right? And I think that kind of experience makes you unique.
I mean, I would agree with that because my career path was similar to yours in that regard. And this is a question we always face and a challenge as an office who, we do single family housing. That's our focus currently. But clients, remarking, well, actually for a lot of clients, they're like, not only do I want you to be a specialist in single family housing, but you need to have done a certain style of housing that I'm looking for and done 10 of those in my neighborhood. And then now I trust you to design a house for me. And this is the sort of narrative that we hear very often from clients, conservative ones. And, as a person who is in it and agrees with what you said, I'm always perplexed. I'm like, yeah, but all that statistics does not equal good architect or good design. So like, why are we talking about this? Like, and also know for myself, I find it really hard for me to believe that if in my career I had only done one type of project that I'm doing now, single family houses, that somehow that would make my work better or more interesting than it is today. I just don't see how that's the case. Design, I think, is all about having a very broad perspective and a broad knowledge base about many different types of things and different types of design skill sets, and then weaving them together for an outcome that feels correct for the project. And so the context, the design scope and vision and context for us when we see our own work, even if it's just a house, is like not just within the realm of single family houses. And I think that's important. I don't have any direct examples, but I know for sure that even my urban design studies and background influences how I think about a single family house. So I can't imagine not having that experience and thinking, and the landscape architecture courses or experience I had with those students and colleagues and professors, not having that and still trying to design the same way that we do today. Like it doesn't compute in my mind. And especially also, frankly, when I see a lot of other architects and developers who do have a portfolio of all these houses we've done. Okay, yeah, but you're in such a narrow lane. You've not learned anything beyond that, and they suck. So to me, there's no evidence at all to support the idea that if you just do the same type of project over and over again, that you'll produce good work of that type of project. It's not true. I don't believe it.
Yeah, I think working on different types of projects is super interesting. Also because you eventually get to meet the different clients for each of these projects. And I think if you think at some point you're going to have your own office, or if you're interested in like how everything works on a project, not just the design portion, which as an employee, depending on your level in that firm, you might only be exposed to like, a small portion of what a project is like, right? It's very interesting. I mean, I work on institutional projects where there is like 3, 4, 5 people that I had to talk to in order to like make the project move forward and get decisions. And then on the other hand, you work with like, I don't know, a guy who opens a coffee shop and it's just him. And you're talking to them directly, and he's the one making the coffee in the coffee shop, So it's kind of
he's
like,
the guy.
Like there is the client, there is the user, there is like the whole, hierarchy, who's making the decision, and how do projects get built, not just from the architect and contractor side, but like from the other side as well.
What do you mean the other side?
The client side,
okay,
right? The client side, like you work with a developer, they think about the user a certain way. You work with a direct end user, they think about the user a different way, right? So it's interesting because I think it's also important information that you need to get to design, right? Understanding like who is behind this project, like what are we trying to accomplish here? It's not just a stylistic exercise. It's like, who is it for? And who is commissioning the work, and who is it destined to, right? So I think it's very important.
I think it's, as you were speaking, it makes me think that the variety of projects types is the same thing as working at different offices. Like I was saying earlier in the conversation, we were talking about the pros and cons of being in different offices from the lens of like, their working environment is like one example, right? And trusting yourself when you feel like something's not right, and not trusting yourself sometimes, and that whole thing. And I think the same thing applies to design itself, and then therefore the clients you work with. And large commercial projects are entirely different functionally in how they run it, and they go in an office, and the teams and the client, the money, all of it's like entirely different from doing a single family house for one person. Yeah. Like so different. And even though they're different, I think the two can inform each other, because I feel like for myself, having that variety of experiences, I now trust myself when I see something that's not right. The same thing as now that I've worked at a bunch of offices, I know what's right and wrong. I don't need to second guess myself if I feel like a project manager is not being a good project manager. I don't need to second guess myself if I think a project being done by a contractor is not being performed correctly. Because I've seen a bunch of stuff. I've seen it from small to big, this type and that type, local. I've seen everything. And I know instinctively, but also based on that experience now, like, no, you should be doing it differently. I don't care if this is how you do it. I don't care if this is normal within the single family residential market sector of people being more disorganized, which is true compared to commercial. I don't care about that, right? You should be more organized. You can be more organized. I've seen it in single family, but also other places. So just do it. Do it that way. There's no more excuses, right? And I feel like that's one of the big benefits.
Yeah, it's very interesting to even like the whole consultant experience. If you work on like really big project and you have like a lot of coordination meetings, with like the big firms to like get, I don't know, like all of your mechanical system and your structural to fit in the thickness of the slabs, for this tower project, you can see like how much. You can tell like how excited consultants are, how experts they are. If you work on a low budget project with a guy that's like really cheap and tells you whatever, and you're like, no, I can tell you this does not work, then it just kind of like teaches you things. And again, I think if you're going to have your own office at some point, it's good to kind of like have a taste of all of those different ways and people out there, because it kind of tells you what is right and what is wrong. in a way that is more truthful, because you've seen a big sampling of like what you were saying. You've seen a big sampling of how it's done.
Yeah.
Therefore, it's pretty clear the right way to do things and the wrong way to do things.
Yeah.
And I think that's also the danger of, when people work at one place, is that they think that's how it's done, and that is the way.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, first of all, that is not the only way.
Yeah.
And that might not be the way at all it should be done.
Yeah.
Right? So, and you don't know that. I mean, it's like your parents are raising you and you're assuming they're doing their best and what they're telling you is the truth. And that's, the way to be raised.
Yeah.
And then, you look at your friends, you sleep over at your friend's house and you go on vacation, then you start dating and then you have your own kids. And the spectrum starts to change a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, it tends to be for me is that thinking back with all those experiences, when I find someone who does something that I believe is the right way to do it, I now know it's possible and I hold myself to that standard. And by extension, to a degree, everyone else I'm working with to that standard because I've seen it done before. I also think that, even physical location is another aspect of this, right? If you work in one city only, right? Especially if it's a small city and that's your experience, you're also still limited to that bubble. I guess another way to think about it is we're talking about bubbles of types of work, bubbles of offices, bubbles of locations, bubbles of different client types. And if you're in your bubble and you're only in your bubble, how do you know? How do you know enough beyond that to the point to where you can trust yourself to say with confidence that no, we should do it this alternative way? It's really, really difficult. And I think that was one of the great things about practicing in New York City is that it is a big city. It is an important city. It has a high caliber of everything in the design and construction, space, and all the many other industries there. And and there's a lot of people, and a lot of offices. So you have kind of within there this density of variety and of high caliberness. And there are also, of course, crappy offices. Plenty of those to experience in New York as well. But you kind of get all that in one place. I've always wished that I could have practiced in an office abroad somewhere, high caliber office somewhere else. I think it would have been very interesting. But I also feel like
you still can.
But I also feel like I've got exposed to a lot, and also actually having colleagues and friends that have worked in other places helps inform your own thinking as well, kind of like vicariously. But I just think it's critical. On the subject of design, talking about design skills itself, the thing that I see that's different between small scale design, let's say of a house, versus larger scale design of a community center, tower, or whatever structured library, something that's big, right? Or multifamily on the scale of hundreds of occupants, or even smaller than that. But talking about those scales of design is, I think when it's very common to find architects who do single family housing only for their work to be very detailed and have nice moments, but as a composition, right, from a party level, it's not very well thought out. There's not a lot of clarity to the overall large gestures of the house. Nice details, but they aren't quite being put together in a way that's and orchestrated in a way towards producing a larger statement or thesis or song or story or whatever. Just like kind of tiny chapters floating around. And when we jump to the large scale stuff, the funny thing with large scale work, if you're going to do good work, not even great work, you can't do that. You can't think about the small details and then hope it's going to be okay. You need to think about the project from that macro lens and think about it almost very systematically, right? So even an extreme example, like when you do facade design, you can't just design like one quadrant of the facade and the next quadrant of the facade and the other quadrant and hope it all comes together. You need to think about the facade all together. And it's a systematic approach to design. You think about the floor levels, how many levels we have, how do we break it down, and the module that you create for the facade gets applied everywhere, and it needs to work at both scales of that module and the entire tower in this case. And so I think designing large-scale projects is actually very important and small-scale is important because you tend to learn, again, details versus large-scale systematic thinking. And it tends to be that in both of those types of buildings, you don't learn both. because of what I just said. And so the same critique applies to offices that do big scale work. A lot of times their work lacks like the special finesse, the magic quality in the details that makes the building sparkle and creates those moments. It is, again, from a macro level, very clear and very organized and has good structure in its design composition, but maybe lacks that, sensitivity to detail. And I think having both is critical. And that's something I've seen repeatedly in terms of the shortcomings, let's say, of different those project types and the architects who do them. And so I've always felt like as young architects, it's good to experience both and to do both because you do learn different skill sets. And I see that even in students when they are approached for the first time, even in school, of designing a larger structure. They're like, wait, now I have to think about this, like I said, module versus component versus system thinking that they've not really had to do before. It forces them to be organized in their design and organized in their thinking. And the same thing continues into the profession as you're practicing. I think you need to have, because I've been in offices that's done residential work, and like there's not a whole lot of clarity in the overall, design.
Yeah. It made me think also like working in like different places that do different types of projects, different scale, different budget too.
Mm-hmm.
It's also very interesting. I mean, even just being exposed to more in depth to, let's say, the different phases of a project is very interesting. Like, I don't know, for example, New York City, getting a building permit in New York City could be pretty complicated. And if you've never been exposed to it, you have no idea how that works, right?
Yeah.
Being able to like work on a project and see how you make it work and how it gets approved, I think is very interesting. At least, from my view, working on a very complex facade detail or facade design, right? Like you've seen it from like the design aspect, thinking about the larger picture, and now you can get to the point where you're actually detailing and doing the technical drawings for it and figuring out how it's going to work. Mm-hmm. Is also very interesting because it, again, kind of brings the more creative and theoretical aspect of the project into reality. Mm-hmm. And how do you transcribe that in order for it to get built? Mm-hmm. And again, if you're working on projects that have very low budget, you probably don't have the hours to get paid to do that. So I think it's a very interesting exercise to be able to experience that, because it shows you how far you can go, mm-hmm. or how little you need to go, depending on the project type and budget and scale, right? And I think it's good to be able to know how to dial it back or forward depending on what the project needs.
Yeah, I think that's especially helpful if you are a senior individual in an office and you're client facing and you're thinking about budgets and how many hours you're going to put into the project. Yeah. Or obviously, if you have your own practice as well, there are these other parameters that you're always keeping in mind of, and that affects everything, the work itself. And it's like you need to have that kind of sensitivity and having, again, all those. I guess the other way to describe it is like these different experiences become reference points, and the mm-hmm. further the reference points are from each other and the bigger the universe, your mental universe is, the better it allows you to know how to position this new project in that universe, whether it be positioning from a budget standpoint, fee standpoint, design, conceptual design standpoint, construction, detailing, project management, all the stuff. Like, where does this fall within that universe? But you need to establish the universe to like really be able to do that.
Or even to understand like what does the project need? Is this project gonna be most impactful if I don't know, like the permitting is the thing about this project. Like it's just super challenging, the site where it's located, and that's what the effort's gonna be about. Or this project, to be successful, we have to have a piece that's just very special, and therefore maybe the building facade is what's gonna become like the project. And kind of like being able to understand, again, the project need from a design or non-design point of view. Mm-hmm. And I think having, again, an understanding of all the spectrum out there is super helpful.
It's also, as you're speaking, I can feel that it might be overwhelming as well, because, you highlighted the facade detailing aspect, you highlighted the working in a project that's for a nonprofit or whatever it was, it's very low budget. You didn't mention, but I also know you worked on a cafe where you experienced firsthand being in the kitchen with the people making the food to get an understanding of how they do it, for fun, obviously, but also to like really understand how you can design a kitchen space around that and make it also part of the design narrative beyond just function. And, so those are 3 examples, but there's like another 100 examples that could easily, probably more than 100, that you could pick out from all the different types of projects and offices and whatnot. And maybe for a younger listener, it's like, whoa. But so obviously I can't experience all of these things to the degree that maybe I would want to, because I do find a lot of architects are genuinely interested in doing a lot of different types of stuff, but time's the problem. Right, we only live for so long. There's only so many hours in a week. You can't do it all equally and learn everything equally before having to feel like you need to choose a path. I mean, I suppose you could, but eventually everyone wants to kind of choose a path at some point, right? Usually maybe around the 8 to 10 year mark. And so anyway, yeah, maybe it's like overwhelming to hear that there's all these things to learn. I don't know what my question is, but it's like, how do I cope with that?
But I feel like it's a personality thing, right? Like if you are, I don't know, like I'm a very curious person. I love learning things. Like I wouldn't find it like overwhelming. I also see a lot of people are very content just doing the same thing. And they're learning with it, that thing, but they don't necessarily want to learn everything. And that's fine too, right? I think, again, it goes back to like being true to yourself, knowing what you are about, what your desires are, what makes you happy, and what do you think you need, right? So...
What about working in large offices versus small offices?
This one I'm always torn, because I feel like if you have a really small team, but they're great people, like you find the right fit, then why go bigger? Like if you find your mate, then that's all you need, right? Like,
I'll also say real quick that finding an office where you vibe with everybody, and let's say they're doing decent work at least, and they're paying you okay, that's not as easy to find as people would think. So if you have been practicing for a bit of time and you find that, it becomes really difficult to let go, because the chances of finding it again are not high.
I know. It's like, again, it's relationships and
yeah, that's true.
What?
It's like I would imagine like someone's dating someone and they're like, there's like 9 out of 10 things are great, but there's just one thing that's really annoying.
This person has
Do
really
I
smelly
ditch
feet
this person and go into the sea of Bumble or whatever the hell app there is now, program?
I mean, you know what you're losing, but you don't know what you're going to find again, right? So it is a gamble.
Or do I just, say like, let's make babies and just commit and then hope that the next 30 years works out? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm always torn, because I feel like if you find like your few people and it's a great office, like why want to change that? At the same time, I love and hate big offices. I love it because I love the energy and the complexity, and I just love the idea of like things being productive.
Yeah.
And the idea of having like an office with, 90, 100 people, and everybody's like working on creating and, like solving things and building stuff. Like it's just super exciting. At the same time, I hate all the politics that comes with big offices and the hierarchy and the extra things you have to do and the initiatives and the promotions and the like, oh, this person did this, congratulations, and all of that. Let's call it bullshit, that needs to be there. Or the competition between, like, I don't know, if the office is, composed of different studios and everybody has their team, but you're all working for the same company, but you're all competing against each other. Like, I don't like that.
Okay.
I don't, and also I think that's why I knew that I was not gonna have a boss for the rest of my life, but be my own, because I just refuse to play with those rules.
Yeah.
And I understand why they're there, because I guess as a business you have to keep your staff excited, make sure they keep growing, they keep learning, they stay motivated. Creating competition is a way to keep them motivated, like if there's no competition, then everybody's just
Well, the competition thing between studios is it's kind of an
Well,
odd
but
one.
you want the best out of your employees, right? So if you
Yeah, I
have
think there's other ways to get there.
I know. I'm not saying I agree with it, but you know.
Well, so when an office becomes a certain size, I mean, even at the scale of just 25 people, there does need to be more structure. And when you get bigger than that, size of 50 to 100 or whatever, it becomes, and anyone who's been in a different industry knows this more than architects, like the business needs to create all of these programs and stuff to have the business feel like it's not just a business anymore, to try and retain, basically you're scaling up the dynamics that naturally happen in a body of 12 people. Yeah. And all the stuff that takes place that makes that organization of 12 people fruitful and productive, but also just rewarding for the employees. When you get to the size of 60 or whatever it is, that doesn't happen naturally anymore, or over the cross of just physically over the cross of that many bodies. So you need to develop ways to create that, and it's by necessity. For a long time, I rejected it because I also tend to agree with you in the just general dislike for structure, let's call it. But at some point, it's necessary. Now,
no, I like structure. I just don't like the fact that it has nothing to do with architecture.
Well, yeah. There's a little bit of like overly planned, fun events and things. Also, I'm not generally a fan of, but the part of the large offices that's not necessary but naturally happens most often is the politics, and that's something that I don't think most partners of big offices are trying to orchestrate a system to create politics. I don't think that's their goal.
Naturally happens.
But it happens, and I also, that's something that it's a waste of, I mean, like, I don't know how many times when we were working at offices, how much time, and we would talk about this, how much time and energy is wasted thinking about office politics, thinking about how to navigate this person and that person to make sure that I appear a certain way. Not that I really care, but also I don't want to look like a doofus. But I will look like a doofus if I leave my fate in the hands of this other person who is an idiot and a bit of a snake. Now I have to engage in this game and play the game. Like, how much time and energy is wasted being spent toward that stuff? A lot, depending on the office. And it just becomes exhausting. And it's like, why am I spending 50% of my time worrying about this, thinking about this? And why is it that that's the hard part? And the work, which is the fun part, is now small relative to everything else. So, yes, that is the case when you get to offices that are larger, for sure.
The plus side, to be positive, of working in big offices is that you potentially could be exposed to more things within that office without necessarily having to move to work somewhere else, right? So if you work in an office where they do different types of projects, you could potentially be working on 3 projects and they're each of a different type. Right. So you don't have to spend 2 years working here, next 2 years working there to experience that. You could try and navigate within that same office to get what you want.
Shift within the office.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You could be part of different teams and this and that.
Yes, I think that's also true. Big offices also by necessity tend to be much more structured at a certain level. It also is easier for people to fall between the cracks and et cetera, et cetera. I was wondering if you could plot out 8 years, let's say 10 years, just to make it an even number, 10 years of working at different offices, what would be the types of experience you would try and gain, and for how long would you be at the offices? If you could somehow magically orchestrate that.
I don't know. I mean, 10 years, well, you probably want to stay in the last office for, let's say, 5, just so you've experienced one a little bit longer. And then the one before that, like 2 years. And then, so that's 7. And then the 3 years before that, move around.
Yeah.
Maybe once every year or so.
I could agree with that math, roughly speaking. I think there's a period of time where I think I think there's going to be maybe 1 or 2 instances where you're going to start at an office and you're going to realize within 2 months, this is not for me. Like, I hate this place. And so that's going to happen. And it's still a worthwhile experience to find out what you really don't like. And then there's going to be some longer term sampling of the magnitude of 8 months or a year or something at other places, maybe for fast-paced projects. Then maybe 1 or 2 experiences that are on the magnitude of a couple years. to really get your bearings. And then somewhere in the mix, I don't know at the beginning, I don't know if it's at the middle or the end of that 10-year mark, you're probably going to be in an office for about 4 years, 5 years, something like that. I think being in an office for that amount of time is also useful, because the reality is, for projects of whatever magnitude, it takes that long for them to happen.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. I think also in terms of pay, that's probably like the kind of like the last point about moving around,
Sure.
right? Is like, how does moving offices impacts your pay rate?
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that?
No, you're the interviewee.
Damn it. Well, I think it's important because every time you switch job, it probably in most likely a lot of different fields, right?
Mm-hmm.
You make more money.
Yeah.
You rarely go about it the other way around,
Mm-hmm.
right? Unless you're switching position, a title or something, then maybe you will.
Mm-hmm.
So switching around when you're younger is a good way to jump up in the pay rate a little bit quicker than if you were staying at the same place, for like a few years. Also, I think once you stay at the same office for a few years, your promotion rate is only like a few percent of your pay. Your pay. So that never really makes up for switching office.
No, switching offices is a faster
bigger
way.
jump.
It's a bigger leap. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's also a good way to understand what people typically pay.
Mm-hmm.
Because you might have friends who work in other offices. You might be open enough to talk to them about how much they make. Sometimes it's kind of a difficult subject amongst friends or colleagues. So applying to other places could give you an idea of what that is, because that's a question that comes up during the interview. And once you get job offers, you can kind of see like how much they're offering you and what benefits, and understand like what's standard, not standard. What can you ask the next office that you didn't ask the one you got in, 2 years ago. So I think that's important. I don't know about, jumping office later on in your career, if you can still get a big,
You can.
a big bump. I think it probably depends on your experience, your responsibilities, and all that good stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. We've had friends who moved offices quite strategically, and they end up making, after the course of 8 years of experience, they end up making like significantly more money than other people. And it's kind of like, well, you're not necessarily better or more talented than these other people. So how is it you're making that much? And it's because they played the game correctly. So yeah, I think you can definitely get a raise if you've been working in an office and you're longer term, for the longer term, and you have more experience, like you were kind of asking. At that point, you become a bit more specialized in your skill set, because what happens is after about 8 or 10 years or so, everyone tends to find their particular thing or things that they are good at and or that they prefer, whether it be, let's say, project management, technical execution of projects, or design thinking, or finding clients, or whatever other things are out there. And that's what takes place. But I think, so for me, in the end, I would say, get a sampling. I think it's important, and I would, if I could, try to be at an office for varying amounts of time, like we talked about. I think naturally that will happen anyway, but still keeping in the back of your mind from a, again, overarching career perspective, I think is necessary.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was thinking too, like, is there an order, if you wanted to work at a firm of different size, to start and end at? I would say the most natural would probably be to start at a small firm and end at a big one, just so you kind of like slowly evolve into a bigger environment. Also, I would tend to think that in terms of pay, you would get higher pay if you work at a much bigger office, and better benefits than if you go the other way around.
Yeah.
So.
and to your point earlier, it's easier to not have the greatest pay, not have the greatest benefits when you're younger.
When you start, yeah.
And also, of course, as everyone knows, when you work at a small office, you tend to get more responsibilities and learn how to become more independent. So, yeah, I would probably do that. I think just as long as you're kind of forcing yourself out of your comfort zone to then experience something that is bigger, even if you are comfortable at a small place.
Yeah.
Because, like, why not? And you can always go backward. It's not really backward, but you can go back, right? So if you find out a good office, like we were describing before, and you're afraid to leave, and the only reason you don't like it is they have smelly feet, just rip off the Band-Aid, go experience some other stuff. And then and the funny thing is when you come back to your previous office and you say, okay, I've gotten 2, 4, whatever years of experience, I want to come back to you, you're going to get paid more, just the way of the nature it is. And now they're going to realize, okay, you're actually a great asset because they know you, they know you, you know them. So there's a comfort. They will be able to trust you because if you're good, you've built up that trust. But now it's like, okay, they now will be bringing additional knowledge to our office that they've learned from these other places. And I know for more certainty that they're going to stay here the long term because they went out and they experienced stuff and they've come back. And now I know that you're serious and you're committed. And you yourself as an adult, as a person rather, has grown as an individual, not necessarily just as an architect, but like as a human being. And you are more sure of your direction in life, let's say.
I'm not sure that it would work that way in a dating situation, but it does for this example.
That's
right?
true. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And probably
business transactions only. Okay, cool. We covered some different things. We might have missed some stuff. So if you are listening to this and you have questions about this topic of working at different places or thoughts about it, then do reach out to us. One way to do that is our hotline, where you can text or leave a voicemail to the number, which is 213-222-6950. What else is there?
We have the website, secondstudiopod.com, where you can find all of the episodes. We are on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, I guess, Spotify, and YouTube as well. You can find a lot of our episodes with videos. We are on social media. Instagram is the platform we're most on. You can follow us, see all of our reels, clips, work samples of our guests, upcoming things that we're in the works. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And if you like the show, please leave us a review, share it around. Much appreciated.
Yep. Great. Talk soon. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.